Welcome to The Facts and the Furious, the podcast covering science or lack thereof in the Fast and Furious franchise. Each episode will recap the fun science nonsense in each movie and interview other fan experts.
I'm your co-host, Melissa Miller. I'm a science writer and also a co-host of the podcast about science and Star Wars called Star Warsologies.
I'm your other co-host, Dr. Lisa Will, a professor of physics and astronomy and also a resident astronomer at the Fleet Science Center.
So in this episode, The Facts and the Furious are going to cover the first movie, which is 2001's The Fast and the Furious, where it all began. We'll also chat about cars as a global cultural phenomenon, which is obviously a major theme in the saga, with our guest, a curator of the San Diego Automotive Museum.
Let's start off talking about our relationship with these movies and why we love them.
Yes, love them very much. It's one of those things I can't quite turn off overthinking about science, but that doesn't stop me from enjoying the fact that they don't obey the laws of physics in greater fashion throughout the saga. To me, they're the ultimate summer blockbuster and probably the franchise I care the most about right now, which is saying a lot, actually.
For us, we didn't start watching these until 2020 when, for some obvious reasons, we really needed some escapism. And we had friends who recommended the franchise highly. And we finally started watching it. And wow, these are ridiculously charming movies with even more ridiculous physics. And it just, how should we say, escalates?
Absolutely. Did you start with the first movie or did you start somewhere in between?
We actually started with the first movie. We did them all in order, and every time things got more wild and just made us love them more. We actually loved how the ambition and the complete disregard for reality ramped up with every movie.
Absolutely. And especially during the pandemic, you're right. That's some good escapism. I think for me, I don't think I was watching these from the start, right? Going back and watching The Fast and the Furious again, it's real dated. You know that this movie came out in 2001 pretty much right away from the aesthetic, also from some of the words they use that wouldn't make the cut these days, and hopefully maybe even some of the themes. I think I started watching these around maybe when 5 came out, when they really start escalating. You know, The Rock shows up. They're all basically superheroes. I think that's maybe when it first crossed my radar. And then at some point I did go back and watch, 1 through 4 and catch up and figure out what was going on and all of that. And then since then it's been like, oh, got to see this opening weekend in theaters. During the pandemic is when F9 came out and I rented out a private theater for my friends so that we could mid-pandemic go and see F9 in theaters and escapism at its finest for sure.
Wow, private theater. Awesome.
Yeah.
I really that I admire. I really appreciate that. We had friends that started recommending the movies to us around halfway through the saga. And what appealed to a lot of them was the found family. It's not just the family by blood, but the huge created family. And that really appealed to me too. And it's probably what keeps me going even when the physics tries to push me away.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that, I have with a friend group here. Maybe not quite as tested in terms of ride or die, but certainly there's that great theme of family. And what I was glad to see, actually, is right from the first movie, they mentioned family. I couldn't remember because now it's such a cliche. I was like, they talk about it and they talk about it right away in movie 1, which made me really happy.
It's Toretto, Brian. It always has been Toretto. Well, I know you've been lying to me. My question is this. Have you been lying to yourself because you can't see past Mia?
He won't go back to prison.
Well, that's a choice he's going to have to make. There's all kinds of family, Brian. That's a choice you're going to have to make.
Having rewatched the entire saga all in a row recently, it is actually really impressive how the writers and directors were cognizant of the pieces that had been put on the board early on in the saga and made sure to keep picking them up. And The way the plots and the relationships are threaded throughout the saga are actually more impressive than the popcorn feel might let you think as you're watching the movies.
Yeah, so far with my rewatch, I've only noticed one thing that they retcon later where I'm like, okay, talk yourself out of that one. All the rest of them, someone's paying attention. And I do appreciate that. Even if you go back and you watch 2001's Fast and the Furious, it is hilarious how low stakes everything is. They are literally, I know it's still Grand Theft or whatever, but they are stealing, and they talk about the DVD players, but they also show television VCR combos. You know, this is how the crew is making their thousands of dollars, and what sends them in the end to be fugitives and sort of like sets the whole thing up in motion is stealing DVD players from moving trucks. Pretty low stakes when you think about it now.
Amazingly low stakes, and yet it's such a way to mark how long this franchise has been thriving. You know, I don't feel like it's been part of the cultural zeitgeist for as long as it has been, but yeah, first ones from 2001, been around for over 20 years. Could make it the longest continuous franchise in many ways, because Star Wars and Star Trek and them all had big gaps. And so this one's been coming out every 2 to 3 years pretty regularly now for over 2 decades. So impressive.
So yeah, I mean, the fact that Dominic Toretto owns like a cafe where Mia makes sandwiches, I literally forgot that was even a plot point. You know, Brian showing up there just to hit on her. Like, hopefully she's a college student, not a high school student, but like everyone looks so young in this movie.
So young, especially Mia. I have to say that was one of my thoughts looking at it too. It's like, how old is she in this movie?
Yeah, I'm not gonna think too hard about that, I guess. So.
Nope. Let's just go on to the science.
Right, exactly. I was gonna say, speaking of, there's definitely NOS, I feel like, in this, which is nitrous oxide, I think,
yes.
is kind of the main science that we have in this movie. It's gonna escalate, obviously. We're gonna, you know, spoiler alert, get all sorts of crazy stuff going on eventually. But for now, it's literally like explosions because people shoot up cars that have NOS gas going through them.
Right. And that actually is realistic in terms of the physics. So NOS is nitrous oxide. You can use it in a car to try to get more power from your internal combustion engine. And so the idea is that nitrous oxide is basically a molecule that has nitrogen and oxygen all hooked up together. And at high temperatures, you can separate the nitrogen and the oxygen, and then you can give your engine more oxygen to do combustion reactions than just from pulling in the air. So basically, you're upping the amount of oxygen that your engine can intake, and therefore you're upping the combustion and therefore giving a boost, as they call it, to the power of your engine. In the movies, they're shown as being short bursts lasting for only about 10 to 15 seconds or so. And that's actually realistic because you have to have these nitrogen gas canisters, these nitrous canisters on your car. And I think the small ones contain just a couple pounds of compressed NOS. And so you're not going to have much to use. You don't want to have these huge canisters because suddenly now you're weighting down your car.
Do you know, is NOS, is that a brand? Because I feel like in the later movies, because they of course have the buttons on their steering wheel and they're labeled. We'll have to ask our car expert if that's realistic. But they say N2O on those buttons, which is the chemical formula for nitrous oxide. Right.
So the answer is yes. There seems to be a brand called NOS, but it's also common usage to abbreviate the nitrous oxide as NOS. And so, yes, the answer there is yes to both.
Okay.
And it's perfectly legal, actually, for the most part in the United States to have this. There are regulations about how much you can have and what sort of tanks you can keep them in, but you can use it in cars. There's different regulations in different states and different municipalities, but it is not a huge illegal thing that they're using in their cars.
Okay. Do you know if NOS gets used for anything besides in cars to soup things up? Like, is this something that you would see in a science lab or something like that?
Well, I actually think it was developed, if I recall correctly, for rocket engines. This has been around a long time. So I think back in the 50s when they started playing around with rocket engines, this was used. But it has a longer history because it can also actually be used as a coolant in an engine intake too, because as it comes in, there's a cooling effect that reduces how should I put it? It reduces the intake air temperature. So the temperature of the air that it's pulling in. And when the temperature goes down in a gas, you actually can increase the density. So you're actually giving a higher density amount of oxygen to your engine as well.
I actually didn't even realize that it was legal as is. So I guess that makes sense because they're just selling it in shops and stuff like that. So
yeah, so I can only imagine you can't have huge canisters around, and it is explosive. So, or it can, I should say, it can be explosive depending on the way it is stored. And as of course, if it's going to, the way it might get hit by something, which is of course, obvious risk in these movies, the NOS tank getting hit.
Right. And I feel like that's something I learned from the Mythbusters is if you shoot any compressed gas tank, it will explode in that it will fire off. It won't necessarily burst into flames, but it will at least shoot off in a very, very dangerous manner. And so going from that to, the car exploding is like, okay, sure, I believe it.
Yeah.
There's enough other stuff in the car and stuff like that. So
yeah, I totally can allow for that because you do still have combustion going on. You have spark plugs, and it's the spark of the plugs that sparks the combustion to begin with. So you've got all sorts of stuff going on in the car. We'll let that big explosion due to NOS go in this one.
Yeah. And it's kind of our first big introduction to also Dom. It's Dom and Brian, first kind of becoming friends or partners or something like that. And then this rival group of drivers shoot up the car and then they show the NOS and it explodes. And you're like, sure, okay, that'll make sense. It's a good bonding experience for them. Turns out none of Dom's other team members hung around to rescue him or anything like that. What I didn't remember from this movie rewatch was how late in the game you find out that Brian's an undercover cop. Like it's literally well after this scene. That even the audience knows, maybe because I saw it later, maybe because it was always described to me as Point Break, just without surfing, that I just assumed we knew that from the beginning, even the audience, even if, Dom and his team didn't know. And it's like a solid half hour in, I think.
Yeah. At first we think people might just not like him because he's flirting with the kid's sister.
Yeah.
Encroaching on the territory.
Well, and that's a theme that's in a couple of these first movies that I'm glad has disappeared too, is this quote unquote, like, you're talking to my girl, kind of thing. So this definitely comes up in 2, it comes up in 3, and then it sort of goes away. And I appreciate that because to me, it's a real outdated making females, characters, side characters kind of nonsense. But thankfully, Mia takes some agency even right away here in this first movie I think, honestly, one of my favorite scenes, and the reason that I like her character, throughout all of the movies, is the one where Vince is obviously jealous. So Vince is one of Dom's teammates, obviously jealous of Brian coming in, has a, carries a flame for Mia, and she knows this. And she asks him all about the date he wants to take her on, and then says, Brian can take me to that place as a date, right to his face. Respect, good for you, Mia.
Yeah, she's one of the characters who has an interesting evolution. She doesn't quite become as superpowered or show signs of being an enhanced human as the others. But over time, I like how she sort of realistically has agency as opposed to some of the others with their superhuman powers. But those superhuman powers actually only show up once in this movie. I just noticed on the rewatch that there is a point where the rival streetcar team is approaching the Toretto house and Dom hears the engine, like he's attuned to hearing the engine before even the audience or anyone else can hear it. For those of you who are fans of the franchise, you know that there is some speculation by team members that maybe they are special later on in the saga. And yeah, there's definitely a case here where we see Dom hearing an engine. Well before anyone else does.
That's funny. I didn't even clock that one. He's like a little kitty cat where just like his head turns a little bit.
Yep.
Oh, that's funny. But yeah, pretty low stakes when we're talking about it, them going off to lunch. I think Dom and Brian go to lunch at some point, drive up the coast, and they're like swerving around minivans, racing some dude in a Ferrari or something. It's like, really, Fast and the Furious? This is what we're doing? But it's perfectly for this movie, but knowing where the franchise goes, you're like, they would never waste our time with it.
Yeah, it is. It is charmingly low stakes in retrospect. And if anyone can find a way to do street racing up PCH, more power to them. The traffic usually does not allow for that, that stretch where they were.
Yeah.
Not that we condone street racing or any unsafe driving in this
No,
podcast.
certainly not. Certainly not. Yeah. So in terms of like the final, the showpiece of this, we also don't know that Dom and his team are the quote unquote bad guys for a very long time in this movie. Like, I actually think they did a pretty good job with these reveals. I can't remember when I saw this the first time, and I definitely didn't go into it completely blind. So I don't know if these things would have surprised me. They use Hector and his team as the red herring a little bit. They use Johnny Tran and his team as the red herring. And it turns out that, yeah, it's Dom and Letty and Vince and Leon, who we never hear from again, and Jesse, who doesn't make it much longer. They're the ones who are pulling off these heists. And so we get to that in the final sort of scene. And, everyone makes it through this part, but it is a great stunt. Moving trucks, some people jumping back and forth, shotguns, like all this kind of stuff that really is, we know and love as Fast and Furious type movie. But also Letty's car flips and she just kind of like, she does bleed a little bit, but that's about it. Vince gets injured from like the cord and gets shot, I guess, too. And needs to be like life flighted out of there. So it's like there's some consequences here. People wear their seatbelts off and on. Some of these things don't make it through the whole saga.
I like how you said wearing seatbelts off and on. There's definitely a lack of seatbelts in this saga. In terms of where the dubious physics comes in, it's actually to me, how much damage the cars take and can still be drivable. You also have cars that roll multiple times, but don't crumple. So they seem to land magically back on their tires and just somehow keep going. And I really don't think the cars would come out as unscathed as they do in the movies. And in fact, I'm pretty sure they didn't come out as unscathed during the stunts that they filmed for the movie itself. But that is fairly standard when you see car chases in movies. The realism there kind of fades. And for example, one of the first things we see in this movie, I think during one of the first heists, is a car goes underneath a semi truck and kind of drives underneath it. Very, very, very few cars could make clearance underneath a semi. So either that semi was riding extra high for that car to fit under it. So don't think that can be done safely. There are very few cars that could make it underneath and still be driving.
Yeah, that makes sense. That stunt actually freaks me out a little bit just from like driving by semis on like freeways and stuff like that. I mean, most of them now, I think it's like a legal thing, have to have some sort of like shield along that part of it. Or I've never quite understood what that's for. That's like an aerodynamic thing or something. But yeah, I wouldn't want to find out whether or not my car could fit under there.
No, the goal is to not find out whether or not your car can fit under there in practicality.
The other thing that I was curious about is Dom's car right away in this one, because I remember him doing it in the future, but Dom gets his car to like raise up and lurch when he starts off a race. It reminds me of like a hungry hippo, just like chomp chomp. And in this case, it's literally just to look cool. But I imagine if a car could do that, it would actually slow you down a little bit because you're not going to land flat. You're going to have to, find your tracks again and stuff like that. But dang, it looks cool.
It does really look cool. I don't know what the purpose would be, what advantage it might give you in some sort of race. And like you said, I don't see how it would help you gain speed. I don't see what the advantage would be. And when you said hungry hippo, I said, yes, that is exactly what it looks like, which makes it sound slightly less cool than they might be going, than the effect they might be going for. But
yeah, I feel like Vin Diesel would probably be upset if I referred to it as a hungry hippo. But like, I'm a science communicator. You use terminology and, descriptions that everyone can kind of understand. So
is it just like saying, yes, this car is a two-wheel drive? I don't know what the point of that maneuver is.
Right. Yeah. Well, we'll have to ask our stunt driver in a future episode about that particular thing, because maybe it is, in fact, a real cool guy thing to do. My only other note really from this movie is for a car that means this much to Dom, right? He talks about him and his dad working on it, and he hasn't touched it in however long because of that and all of that. Because he has this car, again, off and on throughout the saga. but he's real fast and loose with it, you know.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
it gets a lot of damage, and they always montage it up or, you know, show it under work, and then, you know, quick thing, and it's back to normal, and in every single country he goes to and all of that. But yeah, I'd forgotten how much it apparently means to him, and so it seems a little bit flippant, really.
Well, apparently, in whatever alternate universe timeline that this saga takes place in, cars can take a bit more damage. I know how little it takes for an insurance company to tell you your car got totaled.
Oh yeah.
But these cars in this saga definitely take more hits than that. Don't
Yeah,
don't even talk about insurance. I don't even know how.
no, I never even thought of the insurance implications of this. Now I feel like we should get an insurance person on the podcast, because these people must be uninsurable. Because yeah, you have to report this sort of damage, you know, when you get it fixed. Body shops have to say like, oh, this frame is damaged, or anything like that. Yeah, okay. I never thought about that one. Now I'm thinking like these poor insurance adjusters can't even watch this movie because it's just too triggering for them.
I know. And we start off in California, and they got to hold insurance to drive those cars legally, even. So if they want to go to the cafe where Mia is serving up bad tuna fish sandwiches, those cars have to be insured.
I forgot about the bad tuna fish sandwiches. That's like so early on that like it could just be like, and they all got food poisoning and died the end. No Fast and Furious saga.
Well, luckily we avoided that, or we wouldn't have so much fun to talk about.
It's true. It's true. Well, is there anything else from the Fast and the Furious that we should cover?
I don't think so. Just some great, straightforward car racing action in this movie.
Yeah, it really, when you go back and watch it, especially if you've just seen Fast 10, you'll be amazed. And I think, Lisa, your description of charmingly low stakes is exactly the right description for this movie. For Rotten Tomatoes, if you go back and you look at those, it has a 55% critics score, but a 74% audience score, which sounds about right to me, honestly. And the like one sentence review for that is, sleek and shiny on the surface, The Fast and the Furious recalls those cheesy teenage exploitation flicks of the 1950s, which I don't know what that means.
Yeah, that is not necessarily a genre I have a whole lot of experience with, but given our love for the Fast and Furious, maybe we'd like them.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, as a kid of the 1980s, I have not seen cheesy teenage exploitation flicks of the 1950s. But I think I want my stakes no lower probably than this first Fast and Furious movie. So I will just stick with watching this franchise on repeat over and over, probably for the rest of my life, hoping that they are still making more and just going into the next generation and whatever else they come up with.
If you want more science content, don't worry. We know the movies escalate things, and so we'll have a lot to cover soon enough.
Okay, so let's get into our interview.
I live my life a quarter mile at a time. Nothing else matters. For those 10 seconds or less, I'm free.
This episode, The Facts and the Furious, is going to chat about car modifications as a global cultural phenomenon. Our guest expert today is Maria Romano de Leon, who is a curator at the San Diego Automotive Museum. Welcome, Maria.
Hey, thank you.
We're really excited to have you here and learn more about this really essential part of the series.
And so to start us off, can you quickly define what your work is as a curator and tell us how you got into the field?
All right, well, curators, just like at any museum, we do exhibits, we process like intake donations, we are also often the public face of the museum in terms of like the collection or like the mission, so like what we're doing. I go to a lot of car shows and concours, like representing the museum, talking about the cars that we bring. I also, well, my department, not me specifically, I guess, but we'd make all the text, like so all the didactic materials. And then we also do like podcasts and radio spots and stuff. So yeah, cool. I'm at work right now.
What are some of the cars that are in your collection? It's been a while since I've been to that museum.
You know, we have cool stuff. We have a pretty small collection. So we have about 90 cars and motorcycles combined, which for a car museum is not huge, but it's small but mighty. My favorite right now is this. We have a 1955 Chevy Nomad that's really cool. And it doesn't sound that cool, I guess, if you're just talking about a 50s car, but it's cool because it has all these interesting like factory edition, like the person that ordered it got all the options. So it has really funny like mid-century things. Like it has a traffic viewing prism that's they're trying to make it like how today in a car you might have like cameras on three sides. It's like that, so you could see people in your blind spot and stuff. One of the additions, which is just a cute thing, I think, is that it has a special little light called a courtesy light when you open the hood, which we take for granted, right? But was like a fancy thing to order on your Nomad. We have a lot of old cars too, right? We have a cool Cadillac from 1913. We have an REO. Another favorite of mine right now is an MG that we have. It's 1959, so it's super cute, as you can imagine. It's red.
So if there was a Fast and Furious like Streets of San Diego, they would, potentially. I'm like picturing the crew all like coming to raid the museum or whatever and driving out. So.
I don't know if they would like any of our cars because of that. A lot of the hot rods we have, those are only fast cars. They're kind of show rods, so they're not really like street worthy. I don't know. I was going to mention that actually because there is a big distinction between car modifications that are for like performance and then that are just for aesthetics. And there's a lot of overlap, right? But a lot of car customization is for a person's like personality almost, like it's a representation of them. So a lot of car customization, even in Fast and the Furious, is sort of like aesthetic only, which is great still, but not maybe to go fast. And part of it in filmmaking, I think, is like creating a car that is a character. I think part of it is like, creating a person that's associated with a car, but the car kind of behaving not as its own person, but as a reflection of the person.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a thing, right?
It's a really interesting distinction between the car's character versus reflecting the character of the person. And so I guess I would just wanted to ask, do you feel that it's the way the Fast and the Furious does it is realistic compared to what you see in your work?
I mean, I think so. As fans, you probably know more about that than me, but like, do you think of Dom when you see he drives a Challenger, right? Like, so
right. American muscle, always.
Yeah, so it conveys something about him. And that I think that is an absolute reflection of the real world and the history of car modification for sure. People want their car to be a reflection of themselves and like what their values are and how they want to be seen and, what they think is cool.
That's certainly part of it when the team gets bigger and bigger in the later movies, even who's a passenger in someone else's car versus who's driving their own car, whether or not it's, efficient or not for 7 people to be driving in 5 cars or whatever. It's definitely a reflection, right? Because by the time The Rock joins, he's driving these huge armored vehicles, all the time. And then there's still Brian with like whatever blue import he's got and stuff like that. So yeah, that's definitely, you could pick them out. You could decide, you would tell which character is which car, like in that opening scene when it's still all just the stunt drivers and stuff. So
and Roman would have the flashiest one.
Right, exactly.
The gold Lambo and stuff like that.
Right, exactly. Well, yeah, and what you were talking about in terms of like they're not always then really functional cars, the ones that you have in your museum, they're not being something that you could actually do more than maybe even just drag race in or something like that. That's something we'll definitely get into in terms of all of the different stunts these cars do over time. You probably don't have in your collection a car that has been parachuted out of an airplane or gone to space or anything like that.
Nope,
but
we don't have those. Yeah. Although the space one I feel like would be, how would you get it back, right? Are all the cars in space like still in space? Like the Tesla?
The Tesla's definitely still in space.
Still there, right?
And I have a feeling the Fiero didn't make it back down safely. Just my gut says that.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Well, what's your background in cars? Like why this field and this museum?
Well, I studied art history and then in grad school I studied buildings. So like architecture and kind of the importance of monuments. So I ended up in a curatorial department at a car museum pretty much just because I had curatorial experience and because they were looking for different perspectives, which is good because it's hard kind of to break out of the stereotype of people that know or care about cars, I think. You know, if you're not a car person, you might think, oh, it's like a car guy or like a car, there's like an old hot rod guy, right? Or a young kind of like tuner person. And it's so much more complicated than that, right? I think actually the movies show that a little bit too, because there's obviously they're trying to appeal to a wide audience, but there's no stereotype of like who is a car person. I mean, the museum where I worked, which was the Peterson Museum, was trying to reflect that a little bit. Also in the diversity of their collection, it's not just one thing. And then I moved to San Diego. So, and I would say though, my interest in cars is not so much like going fast or like, you know, you hear people talk about, they love the sound of like a engine revving. I think for me, it's kind of the nostalgia factor as like an object that existed in another time or that someone else experienced their life in. That really appeals to me as like a history/art history person.
Yeah.
And you can't question the importance either of cars as like socio-cultural objects in our society. It's like, I think people overlook it as just a tool to get from point A to point B, but they're actually really important.
And so do you think that is something that the Fast and Furious franchise actually tapped into, that cars already had sort of a global handhold and that people would be interested in?
Yeah, I think actually they tapped into that, the nostalgia factor, and then additionally, just the people that want to see a car going fast and hear it rev, right? It's like all of the above. So it's a good franchise for a great diversity of people that care about cars.
No, that's a good point that it's really, there's that in-universe aspect of it too, right? Like whether or not they're in LA, Miami, once they get a location budget, they get, you know, literally all around the world, and everywhere they go, they find a street race, they find, you know, a shop where people hang out, you know, and live their lives all day. And in the Fast and Furious, it is always very hot girls in very small shorts or whatever. So I'd like to think that the actual version of it would be, you know, full of all kinds of people. But, you know, so they tapped into that in universe and also out of universe, right? In our reality or whatever, in terms of appealing to a lot of people. So
yeah, honestly, even the hot girls thing is sort of a nostalgia factor, I think, for a lot of types of automotive customizers, because that's also been a long-term thing. And unfortunately, it is a male-dominated field even now. And there's no, you know, biological reason for that. It's all like a social reason, I think. Like, for example, women, I was reading one time that women can withstand higher like G-forces than men. So they actually should theoretically be in Formula One and like NASCAR and stuff. But it's so unusual to have women drivers.
I'll have to ask our doctor about that maybe when we get to the medical doctor.
That's a really, really interesting. Now I have to think about that one some more. So you've noted that these movies are trying to appeal to a broad audience, and they've been obviously successful in doing so. Have you seen over the years people coming to the museum or expressing an interest in cars or engineering even because of the movies?
So it's hard to say. I think that like in general, maybe, yeah, like someone would ask specifically for a car that was in Fast and Furious or express like surprise at seeing it in real life. But that sort of goes for any car that was in a movie. It's like seeing a movie star, you know? I don't know. Yeah, it's having not done like a study on that specifically, I'm not sure, but I assume yes, that there was an influence and that there was an interaction between like the existing culture already and then, you know, like a before and after sort of like after the franchise started, what people started doing because they heard of things from the franchise.
So probably more people know about drifting now than they would have before Tokyo Drift came out.
I think so, yeah. Drifting definitely like took off around that time, so I'm not sure what the timeline is exactly, but you know, there's a whole division now of drifting, like racing. Formula Drift does it, and drifting was kind of more obscure like in the 90s, I think. So
yeah, I mean, I definitely heard about it only because of the movie coming out, so I'm assuming I'm not nearly the only person.
Yeah.
And now I really want to learn it. Now having done my
Yeah,
rewatch, I'm like, oh, I want to learn this.
it kind of goes along with the whole conversation we're having though about the cultural phenomena of car modification, because a lot of Japanese cultural like basis for car ownership and modification is like a reaction to the phenomenon in America, which dates from like cars being invented, you know? And it's a whole conversation like globally for decades until today. And drifting specifically started, I think, in Japan in like mountain passes in the 70s and 80s and imported here and turned into a totally different thing, you know? So it's just constantly like that. Like it's a really complicated story because of the multifaceted influence of everybody on everybody else.
Yeah, so add Hollywood into that then with these movies and stuff like that, and it's gonna blur those borders or boundaries or whatever even more.
Yeah, for sure. And then I would say like there's major regions that influence that. So like already, I'm not sure if it's because of Hollywood. I don't think so. But Southern California has its own automotive customizations like and racing culture that's hard to even quantify because it's so diverse. And Japan also has a big, I guess maybe being a big exporter of cars or like having an undue influence on the automotive market. That's another like big hotspot for changes in racing and automotive culture.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the LA car culture scene because I mean that's where the first movie takes place. It's where they return to whenever they're not wanted criminals. So, all of this really is rooted in the Los Angeles scene. And even living in San Diego, an hour and a half away, I really don't know anything about that.
Well, LA, I think first and foremost, it's like a car city and it was kind of designed that way. So, freeways weren't really invented until the like after the 50s. So there wasn't like that kind of car culture, but it is like dispersed and huge. And it was designed like to get places in a car. So of course there's going to be a lot of cars and there's going to be a lot of people changing the car to be how they want it to be. I will say like the big heyday I think in LA for car culture is like the post-war period. Hot rods are traditionally associated with Southern California. Street racing essentially led to a lot of racing divisions being created. So like the NHRA is the National Hot Rod Association and they manage a lot of like racing. Wally Parks, the guy that founded it, did so because street racing is super dangerous. So you'll find that trend, I think, also if you look at like racing types, because it's just like people were racing, a bunch of cars didn't finish, people would get maimed. So they'd be like, okay, we need rules to make it more fair. We need guidelines so that people don't constantly die. And that's like essentially what what happened, right? I don't know. I just read a book about how whiskey running in Prohibition is like the root of NASCAR.
Right. I remember
Which
looking
is
at
so crazy if you think about it. But yeah, so the same thing happened here basically, but with hot rods. So you had all these guys that were coming back from the war with knowledge of mechanics from being in the war. They had not a lot of new cars being created because of a pause in manufacturing during the war. So they had all these like Model Ts and stuff around that people were modifying to go fast or look cool or whatever, they were doing. And then they started racing them, of course, because like you get a person with a car and they start racing it. It led to all these other things like, custom culture and lowriding and all these other important car modification cultures basically that are out of Southern California. So LA is definitely like the epicenter of those things.
Yeah, I read somewhere that the original script treatment for the Fast and the Furious wasn't going to be in LA, and then the director was just like, "No, this has to be an LA story." And so it sounds like it was definitely the right call.
Yeah, I think so too. I don't know where else you would do it. Honestly, it seems like it doesn't fit anywhere else, right?
Yeah, but that's the importance of having someone who actually knows, that history or something like that. Yeah, anchoring it here versus wherever the writer was like, I don't know, I live, cars are made in Detroit. Maybe it's in Detroit or, who knows.
Yeah,
So.
totally.
Well, somehow for the first time, I've just realized that they never sit in LA traffic at all. So maybe that's really the least realistic thing. Being bulletproof and landing on cars as a way to cushion your fall and stuff like that. That might all be relatively realistic compared to the lack of traffic.
Honestly, that's what takes me out of the suspension of belief in like all movies is that they're in LA and they're like, yeah, let's just go on the 405 really fast. Like it's not the worst freeway in the entire world.
It is the worst freeway in the entire world. I lived in LA while I was going to UCLA, and the 405 is the worst. I don't think people outside of LA truly understand. But one of the things I do appreciate about the movies in LA, though, is that they go to parts of LA that look like LA. They're not the glamorous parts of LA.
Yeah.
And
yeah, that is actually so cool.
Yeah, I've never seen them drive by the Griffith Observatory, right? Like they do in every other movie set in LA. No, that's a really good point. And I like it when they end up out in the desert too, because that's definitely a thing living in Southern California. If you
and
if you want to get your car up to speed, you go out to the desert.
Totally, yeah. Desert is racing friendly,
Well, I just rewatched 7, and they talk about, it needs a new name and some branding. This car sort of gathering called Race Wars, which, again, I think they should rebrand. But the Dom and Letty actually sort of helped create this event, so it's like everyone meeting on the desert, a legal way to do some like drag racing, look under each other's hoods and all that kind of stuff. Like, are there, real events? You said for your job, sometimes you get to go to car shows and stuff like that. Are these all, in convention centers, or do you get to go out and do some of these, out in the middle of nowhere type versions too?
So honestly, the most common type of car show is not even a show. It's just like a cars and coffee or whatever, like a meetup. It's just people all driving to one parking lot, So, and you pick a genre of car ownership or like a car owner, and they're there with their cars. That's like the way you see stuff. That's the way you meet people. That's the way you like interact with the culture. I would say very few are in convention centers. So like there's like the LA Auto Show. We have a little auto show here too in San Diego. And there's some like big lowrider shows, right? There's the AMBR, but most of car culture is meeting and driving and looking at everybody's engines.
Sometimes when we drive out to the mountains or whatever, drive out to Julian and you see like whatever, 7 or 8 Corvettes in a row. They're all out driving together. And then I drive a Honda Fit, which is like a tiny little, hatchback or whatever. And one day I saw like 10 or 12 Honda Fits in a row. I'm like, is there a Honda Fit driving club? Like, I want to join it. And I just never looked it up. So
there honestly might be. I don't know if there is, but there's probably a Honda club.
Yeah. Can you imagine me just showing up with like the only modifications I've done to my car is add like Disney stickers to it or whatever? Like, hi, can I join the Honda club? I'm sure.
Whatever. I think that's cool. You just have to be proud of your car. You should add a Disney exhaust, like a Mickey exhaust or something.
Oh,
it's a great idea.
So no one knows, maybe you have it all like tuned up and no one can tell. So.
Right, exactly. Nope, the only thing under my hood was last year a possum nested under my hood. And I don't think that helped my performance at all. Because I stopped commuting, right? Because of COVID. And so like animals literally moved into my car. So anyway, you mentioned working at the Peterson Museum in LA. Did you have an exhibit or something like that there that was about Fast and Furious or?
Not specifically. We were thinking about it, I think, at one time, but we do have the car that Devin Aoki drove in, I believe it's the Tokyo Drift one. So I had done a little write-up about that. And then we did an exhibit on tuning. And you can't totally divorce the tuning culture here with like film, especially in LA. So of course we mentioned Fast and Furious in that.
I think a Fast and Furious exhibit would go over really well.
It would go over well, but a huge issue with using cars that were in movies is the condition of the cars. So you basically have to always get a car that's called the hero car, which means it was used in close-up shots. Right. So it's usually the one if the character's inside the car or if it's like right outside the window or if there's a perspective from like the driver, that's always the hero car. Then the cars that are in the, stunts, they just destroy. Like there's no, so if you saw the car like going really fast, it's probably not the one you want to put in the museum. So mostly the cars are like destroyed. Like I think they went through like they could go through like hundreds of cars in getting the right take of a or a certain angle or whatever of a shot. I've heard of like such crazy things. I just came across this in the movie of it was the one with the like General Lee car with anyway, they wrecked like 80 cars making like one shot one time or something.
Oh, is
So
that Dukes
and
of
I didn't
Hazzard?
Dukes of Hazzard, sorry, yeah,
Right,
that
okay.
one. They just burned through like so many with the jumps, that they were doing. So I imagine, I know Fast and Furious has CG, but like they for sure wrecked a lot of cars. So I think it would be difficult to get any amount that are like in okay condition to show. And I think the other problem is that they end up a lot in private collections because they have value, they're like movie stars. So you'd have to build an exhibit that way.
Right.
So it would be a cool exhibit that people would like, but I think you'd have to take a different angle, like modifications, and then you could show how they work and like what they were doing in the movie.
Yeah. No, I think it would be, I think it would be an interesting exhibit because you're right. Like there's a different car that they're driving on the road than the one they're dropping out of a plane, than the one that the person's actually sitting in, the actor's sitting in that's geared up in front of a green screen or whatever. But yeah, not all of them end up in good condition at the end. So, but yeah, we can definitely get into car modifications. That's something I know. I don't even know enough about to like ask a question.
So I had learned about, obviously, I think we have to talk about the Nas thing, right?
Oh yeah.
Go for it. Go for it.
That I feel like is like the joke maybe, or like the thing that came into the cultural consciousness after the first Fast and Furious movie.
Yeah.
So it's basically, Nas is nitrous oxide, so it's like the same thing as laughing gas. It's compressed air. Well, where are we starting here? From scratch?
Yeah,
okay.
Definitely. No, because that's the thing is like, I'm like, I know NOS stands for nitrous oxide, and I have no idea if you actually push a button on your steering wheel and that's how it works, or, if you can blow it up and if you use too much and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think you could blow it up. I don't know actually how safe it is, but I know it's like banned in some kinds of racing. So I think certain types are allowed in like NHRA racing, for example. And it's definitely allowed in Formula Drift, which is super cool. But I know it is banned in NASCAR and in Formula One and probably other ones. There's like so many types of racing. And the reason they would ban it is to either like level the playing field or because it's super dangerous. And I'm going to go with because it's a compressed air tank, it's probably not that safe. Basically, you have an air fuel mixture in a cylinder that makes the engine go, right? That's the basis of an engine. Normally, like your Honda Fit, it just sucks in air like by itself. It doesn't have any forced air. There's no air being forced in, it's just air from like the vacuum of the engine taking up air. So nitrous basically makes the gas burn faster in the fuel air mixture. So it burns faster, basically. It burns hotter too. However, when the nitrous is going into the cylinder, it's going from, because it's from a can, it's going from a high pressure to like a low pressure environment. So it actually cools the gas that's already in there. And then the cooler gas is like takes up less space, so more gas fits too. So once the NOS like starts or whatever, you hit the NOS, more gas can go into the cylinder for the explosion that we want to happen, right? And then because it has more oxygen, it also releases more oxygen with the heat, so it burns more. Yeah, so all of that is contributing to like the cycle going faster. The delivery systems for NOS are like, there's two kinds. I think they're like, I'm not totally clear on like which one's better or anything, but I'm pretty sure it is pretty like a button basically, right? Because it's just a tube that goes to the like turbocharger or whatever.
So just basically you would install some sort of tank.
Yeah, I think you just install a tank that goes to your, so if you modified a car for racing, you probably have forced induction, which again means that you're pushing air into the engine. It's not just getting sucked in from you driving. And the air pushing either gets pushed in via, so it's like connected to how fast the engine's already going. So it's either connected to the exhaust or it's driven by like a belt on the engine, and that sucks more and more air in. So at some point in that system, you would put like a tube of gas. And I think it is illegal to like have on your own personal car. Like I think you can transport the cartridge, but you can't if like they see it, you might get in trouble. I don't know.
Okay.
Again, there's that explosion factor I think is probably the reason it's illegal. But definitely real, definitely a thing that people do and allowed in some kinds of racing.
But
Yeah.
does it cause blue flames to come out of your exhaust?
So I don't know about that. I feel like blue flames coming out of your exhaust means you shouldn't be like having the exhaust so hot, but I guess potentially, I don't know. That's another thing though, is another modification in the movies that is a real thing. I'm not 100% sure about the science, but I know that people say that if you have, first of all, I guess if you remove like emissions things like your catalytic converter, so that there's nothing like filtering your exhaust, then more exhaust will come out faster. So that should theoretically be good for your engine going faster because it can clear the exhaust faster. So that's, I think, why people have like multiple tailpipes or like a really wide exhaust or something, which is definitely also a modification in the movie.
I always associate blue flame with a lot higher temperatures than I would really want around a fuel tank personally, but yeah.
Right.
Yeah, or with a nitrous. Yeah, definitely. You don't want anything that hot next to something that will explode.
Well, what are some other car modifications in the movies I'm trying to think of? That's definitely like the main one we see early on. You know, and in the early movies especially, and they did it in 10 actually, again, which felt like a real throwback. They show the like graphic basically of the NOS being added and going through whatever tube and, you know, combusting and all that kind of stuff.
That's so cool.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't remember that, but yeah.
It's in like the first 3 movies, and then it happened again in 10, and it really felt like it was some fan service or whatever. But so that's when we like understand its role, but I'm sure there's a lot more that we see on screen or just casually there, or honestly, it probably sounds like technobabble to me, you know, like if they're talking about torquing something or whatever, I'm gonna be like, oh sure, that sounds good.
You know, having not like totally read a script or anything, I know in movies some amount of it is always like babble, you know, it's not like, it doesn't really mean anything, but they're probably, I'm sure someone's checking it to be reasonable. I mean, I hope so. Another thing I know they do probably because of the cars that they have is non-physical tuning. So they like will change the car's computer essentially that controls like how the engine fires and stuff to do a certain thing. There's like a ton of things you could do to make it perform a different way. The problem is that sometimes it's dangerous. So I know that engines in the franchise that are popular are ones that are made to tune basically. So you know they're probably also doing that. So like an example is the engine that's in a Supra or a Skyline is a Toyota engine that's called the 2JZ GTE. And that is a super popular engine for tuning because it's very over-engineered. It's really, really sturdy. So it can handle a lot more heat and maybe like capacity than its original intention is. So you can basically get more horsepower out of it without it exploding or crushing itself. That's pretty much what that means. They also even add that engine into other cars, I think. I don't know if they do in the franchise, but probably they did.
Brian, I feel like multiple times will pick 3 cars out of like a impound lot and be like, and then I'm going to combine them all into one supercar. So
yeah,
it's like the engine from this one, the body of that one, so.
That totally makes sense. Although bodies are harder, right? Because weight is really important and then like airflow is important. Although I guess they're not probably going faster than like 200 miles per hour, but it still matters like what you choose and what engine you put in it. They also are big on external modifications though, now that you're mentioning it. So they'll also do stuff like put a spoiler on the back or like a splitter or...
Ooh, what's a splitter?
So they're all related to aerodynamics and they're all about like how the pressure systems form in the front and back of a car. So like a spoiler or a splitter both like affect where the pressure's settling. So for example, a spoiler like breaks up the negative pressure that gets formed when the like aerodynamics are good on the rest of the car. So like if the air goes right over the car, it'll gather in the back kind of, and the spoiler will like break it up. A splitter will do the same thing, but like on the top.
Okay.
Or in the front actually too sometimes. And that's also why you want a dropped car because you don't want too much air going like under the car too. Also,
so by dropped, you mean the low profile that they rest lower on?
Yeah, they rest lower and they'll have like a bumper that's really wide, for example. That's just so like air doesn't go under and mess up the aerodynamics.
Got it.
Because you also have a thing you want called downforce, which is like you want the car to be light enough to go fast, but you also don't want it to like shoot in the air from torque, so like you don't want to press the accelerate and have it like float up. Like a low profile helps with that too. When you're going to accelerate really fast, like a drag race, right? Where the point is basically to get from point A to point B really fast.
10-second cars,
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, when you were talking about engines and you're talking about tuning, is that just like determining where to shift from first gear to second gear to third gear and all of that sort of thing?
So it's like that, but then it's also like how fast is electricity getting distributed to the cylinder, right? What kind of spark plugs do you have that are doing that? What are you telling the car basically in terms of oxygen? So like, for example, your car will have a sensor telling you if the right amount of oxygen is going into the cylinders. You might want to like hack that if you want more oxygen to get in or more fuel to get in. There's a fuel sensor too. And all of those are affected by like internal tuning.
Yeah, because there's definitely a time. I mean, I haven't had a manual drive car for a while, but when I did, it was like, you're definitely in the like top gear by the time you're going like 55 miles per hour.
Yeah,
and then sometimes they're like going 120 and still shifting. I'm like, are you though? But it makes sense that you would want to be able to do that. So you would tune your engine differently.
Yeah, you want it to tune to like different RPMs basically. It's hard to shift like that high though, honestly. Do they have paddle shifters too? Because that's a thing that is theoretically would make it's like a half manual, half automatic.
My Honda Fit has paddle shifters.
Yeah,
it's very silly. I don't know why.
Yeah, that's funny. That's like a racing thing.
Yeah, I like accidentally hit them from time to time, and it doesn't help. But I'm trying to think. I actually can't think of a time that they show paddle shifting.
Maybe because they're like street racing, but like that theoretically should make it faster to shift,
Right.
So they're on track cars more, maybe. I don't know.
Okay.
The ones I can think of are on track cars, and I believe they're in like Formula One cars and stuff.
Yeah, I would like to see that though, because that's actually something I would understand about as much as I would, a clutch and that sort of thing these days.
I think maybe it's just less dramatic because clutches are dramatic. You're like moving a thing in like the car, and it's like a physical thing on your part versus just a little like tap.
Give something for the actor to do in the hero car against the green screen.
Yeah, exactly. And that rev sound, you want that too. And I think that might be part of it also because of the noise, the engine noise.
Yeah, and it does break up the visuals too, right? Because they always show, right, the feet on the pedals and then the hand on the thing, whether or not it's the actor at all in that shot or whatever. Like, I feel like if you compiled every single time they've done that in a franchise, it'd be like, a half hour long or something like that.
It's less fun for sure. And they capture the like kind of visceral feeling of being in a car that's going fast so well. I think that's like a thing they do that really sticks with you after you see any of the cars in the franchise. And that's also kind of was an innovation, I think, at the time, because I've seen like every other car movie and they don't have such a feeling of being in a car. You can like feel the torque in that movie when they accelerate. They also do like cool perspectives, like when from the driver's perspective a lot, which I know is like a filming innovation that they did. I think the director like built a new rig in order to get shots like that. Because shooting cars doing stuff and people in the cars is also a whole thing as well. With or without a green screen, you still need like the person interacting with the physical object of the car, and they always do that in the movie. Yeah.
Now, when we interview someone who runs a stunt driving school, basically,
cool.
That'll be coming up in a couple of episodes. The studios that put an emphasis on sending the actors to the driving school, it makes a difference on screen there, he said. And that I can definitely see that. Like, there are movies where, the actors are even like turning the wrong direction, or, the like trope of just like moving their hands constantly and stuff like that, or looking at the person in the passenger seat. And you can tell the actors that went to driving school, even if their car isn't moving whenever they're on screen, that they know at least when to shift and what.
That's actually such a good point, because in those movies I don't know, I didn't know that they had done this, but it does seem like they're really driving versus like, when you have to suspend belief for a second sometimes when they are just going like this, like hackers with two keyboards, right? Like, it's not really how it ends up looking,
Yeah. Well, and we'll get into that when we talk about movie 8, with the hacking thing, because I don't think that's not all what that looks like. Well, in general, not just with these movies, but when you're watching any movie, I guess, with a car in it, is it distracting? Like the amount of knowledge that you have, is it pull you out very often?
I mean, no, because I don't really like know everything. And I don't really know how to like race or anything. So, in a way, I guess if it's super bad, I could sort of pin it as unrealistic. But I think it's more just like how they act, because it's really when you're driving and you're driving fast. And I think that's like a main point of the movie. It's about like confidence and fearlessness. So sometimes it seems like in a car chase, maybe the character is supposed to be like scared and they don't know what they're doing. And then maybe that contributes to like how the actor is acting. I will say like some stuff in movies is a little ridiculous, like how often cars explode. I think people know about that not really happening as much in real life as it does in movies. Although, electric cars definitely explode more and have harder to fight fires. So we'll see more of that maybe in real life. They do have other cool engines though in Fast and Furious that I wanted to mention because I'm a big fan of rotary engines, and they have the Mazda RX-7s and 8s a lot. I think in every movie they have a Wankel engine, which is a rotary engine, and they're unusual. They're not in a lot of stuff, but they're big fans of people that race because they theoretically can go faster because they're not so limited by the cylinders. They're a circle basically, and the chambers are like corners of a triangle almost, and then they're doubled up. So they have all different like tuning and ideas about like the limitation of the physics of the engine, which are really cool. And I think that actually Fast and Furious maybe caused a resurgence of interest in those engines because they are really weird and unusual and cool and hard to get.
I was just thinking, I remember really loving the shape of the Mazda RX-7 when I was younger, like the ones in the 80s. They were all low, beautifully aerodynamically sleek and stuff like that. So even the shapes of those cars, really those were built for racing.
Yeah, they're super cool.
Cool. Any other engines or modifications you want to make sure we talk about?
I don't know. I mean, like Dom's car, I think has like a Hemi, right? And that's sort of a interesting thing. It's a unique engine that people associate with Chrysler, but maybe I think it's way before Chrysler was invented, but that's when like the cylinder is like hemispherical. So it theoretically will hold more air and gas. I mean, I think it's not theoretical. I think it does, but I guess the advantage that holds is sort of up in the air because there's so many other factors of like how fast your car can go. But that's another like unique thing about his personality, right? He has this like not so common Chrysler engine that he favors.
Are there any movies or shows that you've seen that you really think portray car culture and car modifications and stuff like that really realistically?
It's hard to say. I think sometimes cars that appear in movies and film realistically depict maybe like the position of the car in the culture a lot. So I think that might not even be on purpose sometimes, but that's an interesting thing to look at, like who has what car and why. An example I always like to mention is Walter White's Pontiac Aztek in Breaking Bad, because of what that car like meant at the time and what it symbolizes for him, and how it's like a recurring character in the movie that kind of has its own like story that's not related to his story, but that parallels it. I think if you look at like that relationship more than like maybe a modification or like what the car is doing, that's really accurate in a lot of movies, right? It tells you something about who the person's supposed to be. And that's a really interesting fact. And that's in Fast and Furious too.
Yeah. I just rewatched 7 where Brian is driving a minivan and driving his kid, to school. And I mean, obviously it's out of character. That's the point of the scene.
Yeah.
But it also didn't seem like he or Mia would get a minivan, right? Like you can put a car seat in the back seat of a, some other sort of car.
Yeah,
something.
you can. But it's a priority change, right? It's safer to have your kid in a minivan. It shows like that his character changed with time and with responsibilities. And that, again, isn't the whole thing like family and like family matters, right? So he wants to keep his kids safe in a car seat in a safer car. It's not supposed to go fast.
Yeah, but he's still there revving the engine in line for like, kindergarten drop off or whatever.
Can he even help it though now? Like he has to rev the engine. He probably did get a nice like, I don't know what kind of van it is, but I bet he got like a V8 one.
So, do you have a favorite character from the Fast and Furious franchise?
I mean, not really particularly. Again, I am a big fan of Mazdas, so I guess I like the characters with Mazdas because when I see them on a screen, I'm like, oh yeah, cool. Otherwise, I mean, I think that because the characters are so tied to the cars that you don't have to make the distinction so much between them. So maybe like because you like the car, you like the person. I don't know. What are your favorite characters with cars?
Yeah, that's a good follow-up. We should add that to our list of questions. It's like, if you don't have a favorite character, do you have a favorite car?
Yeah.
And really, don't they end up being the same probably most of the time?
Yeah. Roman has a different car expressing his flashy personality and mood in every movie. So I think I'd go with him just for the sheer variety of vehicles.
And that's a good point, though, because Roman is probably one of my favorite characters, but he's so well, and this is part of his character too. Both his personality and also the cars, it's all about like, getting women with them. And that's not my favorite part of it.
Yeah, yeah. Why do the women like the cars he has?
Yeah, Roman, I mean, as far as his love life is concerned, or as much as they show us, it's all about like when he's got money or flash or things like that. That's what he's putting out there, and that's probably what he's attracting to.
Yeah,
so
flashy.
Right. They don't actually ever show him having a conversation with a woman, mind you. Just rev the car engine. You don't need to have a conversation. What I always like that they show Letty, driving a motorcycle basically whenever she can, even if it's not like at all functional to whatever heist they're trying to pull off, fun stunts and stuff.
That probably says something about her too, because that's a whole different ballgame in terms of like racing and like cultures, right? Motorcycles are a totally different animal.
So you came into your field currently via an art history background, but if somebody wanted to be a curator at an automotive museum, what would be the path that you would recommend for them?
That's really hard because as a curator in an automotive museum, I also know a lot of them and they're all so different. My old mentor, the curator at the Peterson Museum, he is like your classic car nerd with an encyclopedic knowledge of every single thing about every car. So there's people like that. Then there's another friend I have. She was like a photographer before and she worked kind of on the aesthetic side of cars. So it really depends a lot on like maybe what brought you to it. I think also though, you really have to have like an open mind about the types of people and cars that you're going to encounter. So you can't just be like, oh, I love, Ferraris. So that's why I want to do this because Ferraris are the best. Like, because then you should probably just work at a Ferrari museum because there's such an incredible diversity of cars and people that like cars and things you've like absolutely never heard of that somebody's really into that is maybe worthy of study and showing people. So I would say then I guess just go to college and study what you want to study and then get involved with the community or get involved in curatorial work. That's what I did. There aren't really that many car museums compared to like other kinds of museums. So I think that if you can just do the basic work involved in working in a car museum, which is like writing, honestly, mostly, or like reading about stuff, then you could work here too.
Well, if people want to follow you or follow the museum on social media, do you have any links you can share?
Yeah, I think we're the most active on Facebook, and our Facebook is San Diego Automotive Museum. We also have a website, of course. It's sdautomuseum.org. And so our Instagram has stuff going on, and that is San Diego Auto Museum.
Cool. We'll put links to that in our show notes.
And I do feel compelled because we are nerds to mention that you are located in Balboa Park across from the Comic-Con Museum.
We are,
right.
Yeah. Across the street from Comic-Con or across the parking lot. And then we're next to Air and Space. So if you like planes and cars and are into Comic-Con stuff, you definitely want to come to this part of Balboa Park. We have some cool new exhibits coming up. In fact, the reason I read that book about NASCAR is because our next exhibit is called Bootleggers, and it's going to be about that connection between early car modifications during Prohibition and the development of like racing.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
See that.
Yeah, we have some cool stuff lined up for it.
Nice. Well, Maria, I want to thank you so much for spending so much time with us, answering all of our questions and talking about all the car modifications and car culture stuff.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. It was nice meeting you guys.
Thank you.
Well, that wraps up this episode of The Facts and the Furious. We want to thank our guest, Maria Romano de Leon, and we want to thank all of you for listening. Remember, reality-based physics comes and goes, but family is forever. If you want to see the links to the Automotive Museum and other things that we chatted about, those will be in the show notes.
See you next time on The Facts and the Furious when we discuss Too Fast, Too Furious and welcome a legal expert to the family.
Vroom.